Next up, Alley Oop. This is a song about a comic strip caveman, and I was surprised because I remember this from my childhood. I'm old enough to have looked at the funnies as a kid in the newspaper when we had newspapers. This comic strip is still going to this very day. I would have thought it was long gone. Started in the 30s. It's about a caveman named Alley Oop. This was a #1 song in 1960 by a band called the Hollywood Argyles. This is one of these bands that wasn't a band. It was a guy that went in the studio, that had some time, and decided to do something that became a hit. Hollywood and Argyle, or that's an intersection of streets in Hollywood. It's interesting to contemplate that the Hollywood Argyle, the people that were involved with that record are a lot of Bruce's buds that we talked about in the Bruce episode. Richard Polidor, Kim Fowley, Sandy Nelson, Gary Paxton was the singer and producer who was in the band Skip and Flip. So, again, a lot of these are people that were in Bruce's orbit around that time in the pre-Beach Boys era. Again, got some ass on the bass, and it's Bruce once again on in a very satisfying sound on this one. Brian's playing bongos on this, the only time he does it, and does a pretty good job. Very satisfying high harmony going up, just loose enough to be awesome. Brian's leading the charge there. Mike's killing it again on the lead vocal. Even though this is a great, hilarious grizzly bear brain fart at 1 minute 14 seconds. Mike begins to swish at 2 minutes and 30 seconds. For those of you that don't know what swishing means, it's when you adopt an exaggerated, gay, stereotypical vocal affectation. Wouldn't fly these days, but this was a thing back in the 60s. It was okay humor at that time. And at 2:50, after the swishing and the brain farting, tuning begins. And that means we're going into There's No Other Like My Baby. And we have the obligatory Spector cover. Surprising that there's only one, given Brian's affinity for Phil Spector. This was a Crystals track. It went to number 20 in 1962. It was the first single on Phil Spector's Phillies label. It would become the B-side of The Little Girl I Once Knew, which was the single for the album that wasn't on the album. No Dennis again here. It's Hal Avery on the bongos. It's from that session where Hal had to leave early. Brian brings this one in, no surprise. It's Spector's his wheelhouse. It's mostly single-track lead vocal. There's a lot of single-tracking in this album, but there's a lot of loose double-tracking when they would kind of sing over their own parts at the party. They didn't do that here, but they did do a much wider, which is to say looser harmony attack on this one. Brian very prominent on the backup. My favorite part of this is the mangling of the girls' names at 2 minutes and 12 seconds. On the original part of this, Johnny, Larry, and Tommy were the male names that were on the Crystals version. On the Beach Boys, they reference women in recent Beach Boys songs, including the unreleased Sherry from Sherry She Needs Me, which kind of indicates to me that maybe they were still thinking about releasing that song. Interesting to think about. Anyway, there's not much else to say about There's No Other Like My Baby. There's no other like this song. There are. There's a bunch of other songs like this on the Party album, and they're all right here. But they do this mangling name joke again on the live version of Barbara Ann on the Beach Boys 69 album. We'll talk about that years from now whenever I get around to covering that album. And this brings us to the first Beach Boys medley. Yes, there was one before 1981. The Beach Boys had run a bunch of their tunes to destroy. They tried Don't Worry Baby and California Girls. And just parenthetically, they didn't use either one of them. And when we did the AMCB party thing, the thing that I'm letting the patrons hear, we did California Girls. Because at that time, I don't remember what show we were preparing for when we did the AMC party album, but we had rehearsed California Girls for that show. And I thought it was the weakest thing we did on that party parody thing. And I don't really know why. There was nothing really wrong with it. I think it's just because it's hard to screw that song up. But you've just kind of got to do it the way it's done. And there's nothing really interesting about taking California Girls apart, unless you're going to do a full-on parody like, what is that song? I'm blanking on it. White Album. That one. You're all screaming at me. What is the song? What is it? Back in the USSR. There it is. Thank you. 99% of you got it before I did. So I don't know. I'm just thinking they probably tried California Girls. There was nothing interesting about them mangling their own song. But I get around a little Deuce Coupe, the mangle they did. Has anyone ever done this before? I'm kind of curious. Just taking your own song and trashing it. There's a little bit of Jan and Dean did this. We're doing this about the same time. And I kind of wonder, given some of their antics that we hear in the Filet of Soul album, if they hadn't gone to a Jan and Dean show and just gave them the idea to do this. Interesting that Bruce is doing the falsetto and not Brian. And I got to say, that this is one of the reasons I think Bruce didn't just take over Brian's parts flat out. Bruce tended to do the falsetto on this one live, and he would get lost a lot. When he goes up to I get around, you just kind of can't hear him. He doesn't project. Hits the notes just fine, but he just kind of gets buried. Whereas Brian just, I get around. You're not going to miss that, right? Ice pick. So it's interesting they had him do this, but he gets lost here just kind of like he got lost on the on later versions when he did the falsetto. Not dissing Bruce, just saying, it's just a fact. Dennis seems to be singing on this. I think I hear him doing his round part. It doesn't sound like him because his voice is real scratchy from the bronchitis, but I think he is singing on this. Hal's on bongos, apparently. Mike's swishing again, doing his little homoerotic approach to the song. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. I love when he goes, rock out, Carl, anybody. And it reminds me of the Beatles outtake, If You've Got Troubles, which is a song that they hated. And Ringo goes, rock out anybody, because they know the track's just going down, and Ringo's just trying to make it happen. And it's that same vibe where Mike says, rock out, Carl, anybody. Like, this isn't really rocking. This is just doing the thing. So then Carl does the solo and he butchers it. And he just mangles the whole thing. Then he moves right into jazz chords, which is hilarious. And then Mike changes the lyrics around, and they're also hilarious because he's not even. It's like they're not really trying remotely to get the song right, and in not trying to get it right, it doesn't sound like they're trying to get it wrong, which is what makes it funny. There's more humorous Mike falsetto. I think this album's the most Mike falsetto we will ever get. If you want to hear Mike falsetto, Beach Boys Party's your album. So we got some Mike falsetto here around the We Always Take My Car, and then we Always Take My Car, even though it's a heap. This is a bit like Jan and Dean Meet Batman, which came out the next year, where they do a couple songs on that, and they don't even try to get them right. They just screw up the lyrics, and they just keep right on going. You hear Carl address Brian and Bruce by name, and then they get into Little Deuce Coupe, which they do in a Tom Jones Elvis style. And then someone starts talking about doing Luau, which was one of their very first recordings, a B-side that was written by, if I recall correctly, the son of the Morgans who ran the studio that they did the song at, or did the label. I don't remember how this all went down. But anyway, it's interesting because it sounds like it's Carl demanding that they do Luau. And Carl, there's an outtake from a thing that the Beach Boys did in the late 80s where they did a beach party, a campfire unplugged thing. Somewhat similar to this album. We'll get into this again because there's some callbacks to this album at that special, and you can see most of that on YouTube. But there were some outtakes. I got to hear them once, and there's a really interesting outtake from that where Brian and I think Mike are talking about Luau, and someone says, "I thought it was kind of interesting," and then you hear Carl just very firmly say, "I thought it was pretty shitty." So, and Carl's just like, he apparently did not like the song, thought it was crap. So it's interesting if Carl felt that way, that he's the one that's kind of bringing the song up here. Maybe because he hated it, I don't know. But anyway, someone wanted to do Luau, they didn't do it. Brian and Bruce have a falsetto war at the end. And it's interesting, since I did my Bruce show, Bruce has done a really interesting interview, and I want to see who did it because it's one of the best interviews with Bruce I've ever seen. It's the first time he actually talks about how he learned bass, because we talked about that a lot. Yeah, okay, here, this is it. It's with Valerie Samadas, and I don't know who Valerie Samadas is, but I want to commend you, Valerie, if you watch this, for this outstanding interview with Bruce. And what the heck was I talking about? Oh, yeah. So this is a very interesting interview, and if you watch my show about Bruce, there's a lot of stuff gaps in that got filled in this interview, and I'm hoping that it helped provoke some of the topics here. But even if it didn't, I love this interview. And Bruce talks about how around this time, Brian and Bruce actually had a falsetto contest to see who could sing higher. And Bruce actually won, which doesn't surprise me. Bruce can sing really dang high. But so you have Brian and Bruce doing the falsetto war here at the end of this. And that's pretty much all I have to say about I Get Around a Little Deuce Coupe. We know the history of those songs. They were both, I think both of them were done on the In Concert album before. I know I Get Around was. So again, they're kind of going a little far to the well from what they already did in concert on this album. But whatever, it sure is fun hearing them trash their own song. This is from one of I think the second to the last session for the album. They didn't get much else done other than this at this session. This was the main thing they had to get done at that session. And they did. So, and we're happy. Yay. Next up, the Beach Boys take on the protest movement. And boy, are they serious about it. Not really. This track is fascinating. It's The Times They Are A-Changin', of course, one of Bob Dylan's most famous early songs. Al Jardine, the group's resident folkie, is given the assignment of carrying the ball for this. I find this track fascinating because when you listen to the songs here, there's a lot of respect. Even though the band's having fun and they're being loose and they're not taking it all that seriously, when they're having fun with the early R&B songs, it's very much in the spirit of those songs. When they do the Beatles and when they do the Everly Brothers, you can tell these are bands that the group really deeply cares about. There's even though they're loose and they're fun and they're a little sloppy, there's no disrespect. Not true here. The band couldn't be less interested in the song other than Jardine. And it's interesting because Al really, it's an overdub vocal, by the way. Most of the lead vocals here are live, but I think Al overdubbed this. And Al sounds like he cares. He's giving it his best shot. And it's interesting to hear Al do Dylan. Al sounds like he understands the material and is doing it. And the band is just not giving him any love. I mean, even the reel calls it protest. So they're not even dignifying it as a song. It's a genre that was sort of coming into vogue at the time that I think the Beach Boys looked at a bit cynically, or as if you want to look at it in a different light, they are a privileged bourgeois white band. They weren't necessarily going to have a lot of affinity for a lot of the topics that the protest movement was centered around. The demographic the Beach Boys came from, there's so much social comment that could spring from that right to the present day. But the bottom line is that this wasn't their wheelhouse. One of the most widely reviled songs in the Beach Boys discography is Student Demonstration Time, where Mike Love actually wrote his own protest song. And for those of you that would be critical of the Beach Boys disrespecting Dylan or not sort of having a certain level of affinity for this type of music that was coming up, keep in mind that when the Beach Boys tried it, and I think they were, by 71, the Beach Boys were on this train. Most of them, I think they legitimately cared about things like the environment, civil rights, and even Mike. I think they were all. This was a real issue for them. But when they tried to do stuff like this, it didn't work a lot of the time. In Student Demonstration Time, people hate that song. I don't actually. I mean, I think some of the lyrics in it are kind of cool, but most people just like, no, don't go there. So the Beach Boys, however you feel about this, the Beach Boys sound a lot more authentic making fun of Dylan than they would if they just let Al sing the damn song. And, you know, I'm going to sort of out myself as being, you know, from a certain shallow background. When I first heard this album, you know, and I was probably 18 or something, and didn't really have care about Dylan, and heard it the way a lot of people would have heard it at that time, which is, this is simplistic music from a guy that can't really sing. I liked hearing this version of Times Are A-Changin because it just sort of popped the bubble of pretension there. And I have, given where Bob Dylan came to feel about his Spokesman of a Generation role, I have to wonder if Bob Dylan himself kind of didn't get a kick out of hearing this song punctured a little bit. I can't speak to that. But, you know, there's an argument to be made that maybe in 1965, when this kind of thing was all the rage, and it was so sincere, and it was so earnest, and it was so naive in some ways, even though I don't think Dylan was naive, but the whole movement had a naivete, which sort of merged into the excesses of the hippie movement. Maybe someone needed to do this kind of a version of the Times Era Change. Just like, no, we're not even, this is a party, boo, you're harshing the party. So anyway, Al gamely sings, and the everyone is right, wrong, and they're just totally crapping all over his performance. Bass player is not on his game, whoever it is. I think it's Bruce probably, because it's got that same deep sound. When Al sings like a stone, you hear Mike go in the mic, go glub. There's just, the band doesn't, other than Al, the band doesn't give a shit about Dylan. Though they do kind of begrudgingly sing along at the end. Someone's banging a primitive piano, someone who doesn't know what they're doing. Maybe it's Mike. Could be. You do, because you do hear Heart and Soul at the end, which could be played by anybody, because everybody learns Heart and Soul, right? So I have to wonder if Mike isn't one of the people playing Heart and Soul. But what's interesting is each one of these songs segs into, there's a segue into the next one, and with a lot of these. And Heart and Soul was a song that Jan and Dean covered. And we're going into Barbara Ann, which was another song covered by Jan and Dean. So it is kind of setting up the next song. But before we get to that, because we're going to have a lot to say about Barbara Ann, again, this could scarcely be less respectful. It shows the Beach Boys' ironic take on the folk boom. It's very clear throughout this album that this album is intended to be an album that works within the context of the then burgeoning folk rock movement, but that was an ironic and not very sincere entry into the sweepstakes. The folk movement allowed the Beach Boys to get away with this album, but the Beach Boys were not making a folk rock album. They were not a folk rock band. There's a certain way you can look at Dylan, and if you miss the point of Bob Dylan, this is a totally valid piss take. Okay, next up, Barbara Ann. Well, this song took on a life of its own, didn't it? We got a lot to say about this one. Barbara Ann was originally written by a guy named Fred Fassert. It was number 13 in 1961 for Fassert's band, The Regents. Jan and Dean also covered it in August 1961 and released the song as a non-single album cut in August 1962 on the album Jan and Dean's Golden Hits. And I want to acknowledge for this song the help of Mark A. Moore, the world's leading authority on Jan and Dean, who sent me a lot of information on this song. Now, the reason we would want to involve Mark on this is, as most of you know, Dean Torrance of Jan and Dean is a co-lead vocalist with Brian Wilson on this track. So before we get into how that all went down, let's talk a little bit about what happened to this song, because Barbara Ann is now widely thought of as the Beach Boys, and it's actually one of the Beach Boys' best known songs of all time. And it all springs from this session, and it was never intended to be a single. The single was Little Girl I Once Knew. Barbara Ann was just something that they did for fun, and they weren't even planning to do it. It was Dean Torrance's suggestion, because remember, he had done it with Jan and Dean. So what happened is, and we'll discuss this in a minute, The Little Girl I Once Knew was one of the Beach Boys' most interesting and most experimental singles to this date, and the biggest innovation of that song was they put a pause between the end of the verse and the chorus twice in the recording of the song. And this freaked out radio programmers because they were afraid that listeners would think it was dead air. And so they really resisted playing this record. But they really wanted to play a Beach Boys song. So they started looking for something else to play. And Al Corey, who was a Capitol Records executive, pulled Barbara Ann off the album without asking the band, and I'm sure Brian was mortified, because this album was filler. Little Girl I Once Knew was another step in his progression as an artist. The Beach Boys Party album was something he did to get people off his back. But the label snuck it out, put it out right about the point where Little Girl I Once Knew was starting to lose steam, and Barbara Ann just completely wiped out the previous single. It became a massive hit, number 2 in the US, almost went to number 1, number 3 in the UK. Huge hit in Europe, their biggest hit ever in Italy. And it's kind of amazing that this song became such a hit, because it's all over the place. I mean, this was never intended to be a single. It's a mess. It's a great mess. But I mean, there's off-key notes, there's false starts, there's an ashtray solo, which was overdubbed, by the way, that was added. So what was that about? Al and his famous ashtray. Al's perhaps his only solo on a Beach Boys record is banging on an ashtray. But Barbara Ann became a phenomenon, and it's doubtful the Beach Boys have done a show since without playing it. And they probably thanked God for it live, because they were getting into the Pet Sounds era where they were having to pull off stuff like God Only Knows or Wouldn't It Be Nice, stuff like that, Good Vibrations. Those songs are really difficult to play live. Barbara Ann, any old fool could play this song, and it's always going to work in front of any crowd. So they were probably happy to have a reasonably current hit that was easy to play live. But I'm sure Brian was not thrilled, and I'd probably Carl either, because this was a step backwards for them. It was one thing to do the Beach Boys Party album, but we're just messing around here. That's one of the reasons that they made it the way they did, because I think they wanted it clear that we're just screwing around. This isn't us at full capacity, okay? But you pull a single off of it, and you have a big hit single. Now it becomes representative of the band. And I'm sure they were not thrilled. But a hit's a hit, and they got a hit, and it should be pointed out. I said this before. This was a hit well into '66. So we've got, in the same year as Pet Sounds, you got Barbara Ann being at the top of the charts. So how did Dean Torrance wind up on this track? Well, what was going on was Western Recorders, where they were doing this, Western Studios, they had a couple of different rooms. And the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean on September 23rd, 1965, which was the date this was done, they were in adjacent studios. The Beach Boys were in Studio 2, Jan and Dean were in Studio 3. Now, Dean has told the story that he had a fight with Jan because Dean didn't want to sing on a track that he hated called You Really Know How to Hurt a Guy, which, okay, it's actually one of their better singles, although, to be honest, Jan doesn't sing it very well, but it's a great song and a great track. But it probably taken itself a little too seriously for Dean's taste, and maybe there's actually a hilarious video of them lip-syncing to it on YouTube, one of their last performances, actually, before the accident that damaged Jan Berry forever, where Dean just starts playing a tennis racket like a guitar, and Jan's just laughing, because Dean just doesn't want to be there, I guess. So it's a statement, like, you sing, I'm going to play this tennis racket. But anyway, this story is bunk. And this is one of the reasons I reached out to Mark, because I was pretty sure this story was bunk. And I had heard it was another song called Universal Coward, which is a Jan and Dean pro-Vietnam War track that I can see Dean not liking very much. It's a way more objectionable track than You Really Know How to Hurt a Guy, and not just because of its politics, but it's just, there's no fun in it at all. So you can see Dean not being into that song either, but that wasn't what they were cutting either. They were cutting Everyone's Gone to the Moon, Let Me Be Me, Let Me Be, sorry, and Where Were You When I Needed You, only one of which found its way to an album, and they were doing instrumental tracking. And the main reason this fight happened was Dean was at an instrumental tracking session, and he had nothing to do, because Dean didn't play on the records. I'm not even sure Dean could play guitar at that point, but anyway, he didn't. And I don't know why he was at the tracking session, but he had nothing to do, and Jan wasn't going to let him do anything because Jan was a producer. So Dean was just sitting there bored out of his mind, and apparently by Bruce Johnston's account, the account of the engineer, Dean just got sick of sitting around and went down the hall to see what was shaking with the Beach Boys. And he walked right in, and they asked him what he wanted to do, and Dean said, let's do Barbara Ann. So it was Dean's idea. So Dean starts out singing the bass line with Mike, and then you can hear Brian go, hey, why don't you sing up top with me? And then, so the song is Dean and Brian singing the falsetto in tandem. And this is really interesting because Dean, love him, pitchy, real pitchy falsetto singer. You can tell where he is on Jan Dean records, because a lot of times they would use P.F. Sloan, the songwriter, as the falsetto singer, and so P.F. Sloan would nail those falsetto parts. If I remember correctly, it's some Little Old Lady in Pasadena. It's the little old lady. It's real clean. So it's interesting because Dennis was there, but he doesn't seem to have sung on it. But he seems to have been in the control room, because you hear him yell, hey, Dean, sing on key. And there's a later interview with Dennis from around 67 where they talk about Barbara Ann, and Dennis goes out of his way to diss Dean's singing. He actually says, yes, Dean Torrance sang on that recording the parts of it that were out of tune. So, and it's interesting because I've talked about this before. You think about Dennis as being sort of the least vocally talented of the main Beach Boys, but be that as it may, Dennis grew up in the house with Brian and Carl. Dennis knew how to sing in tune. He didn't always pull it off, but he knew what he was supposed to do, and by God, he was going to hit the notes if it killed him, even if he wasn't the greatest singer. So it must have driven him nuts to be sitting out the session and then listening from the control room and listening to Dean singing out of tune. So what's interesting is Bruce, in an interview with Mark, actually talks about the same phenomenon. And Bruce, who's actually got a real pure falsetto tune and no pitch problems, hears this, as a producer would, hears it a little differently, in that the imperfection of Dean's vocal rubbing against Brian's vocal is what made it commercial. And I'm going to quote from his interview here that Mark sent me. This is Bruce speaking. You know how a guy gets his hair looking really cool and then his girlfriend messes it up a little and it looks perfect? That's what Dean's vocal did, combining the perfect vocal from Brian with Dean's not so perfect but still just as commercial way of singing. It's a beautiful classic. I'm not trying very hard. We're just having a great time singing sound. It's interesting how both Bruce and Dennis take note of Dean's technical imperfection here, but Bruce, who we would think of as being the more pretty, less punk rock member of the band, is kind of going, yay, it's punk rock, it's working. And Dennis, who we think of being more rock and roll, rough edge, it really bugged him that Dean was singing out on this. Part of that could be that Dennis, as far as I can tell, wasn't singing on it, because it sounds like him on the talkback. So it sounds like Dennis was sitting it out, probably because of his bronchial infection, but he was in the booth watching, and he was unhappy. So anyway, as Bruce says, and that song today is such a staple in the Beach Boys world, and every time I listen to it, I can hear Dean every time I go, oh God, the girl messing up the handsome guy's hair, and then it was perfect. So Dean was the right guy at the right time, and the right guy at the right time being Brian. That's just one of those accidental cool things. So that's how Barbara Ann came out. The bass on this is really excellent. It's been asked, who was it? It was Brian. Brian played bass on this. Bruce putting up Brian playing, using his fingernail as a pick, something he did occasionally. And a lot of people haven't heard the long version of this, because the single fades out, it really falls apart at the end. On the album version, it doesn't really end. It just kind of dwindles. They try to end it, and then it falls apart, and then they start again, and with more artistic flavor, as Mike says. And then they give it a big vaudeville stripper ending. You got me rocking, you got me reeling the bob around, and it just sort of kind of disintegrates. Carl says, thanks, Dean, which was really interesting because apparently, so there's more to talk about with the Jan and Dean connection with this album, because I've said over and over that this is almost like a Jan and Dean record, like conceptually and how it was done. And so apparently Jan and Dean were supposed to do this album with them. They were supposed to be singing along with them. And Jan and Dean's label, Liberty, were just, no, you're not doing that. You can't be on the pictures, you can't be on the album and stuff. So there was kind of a deal where Dean was just supposed to sneak in and sneak out. It wasn't supposed to ever be acknowledged that he was on it. In fact, Dean goes back into the studio and Jan's feeling kind of uptight because I guess they just had a fight. So Jan goes, did you sing with them? And Dean goes, yeah. And Jan says, what did you do? Is it Barbara Ann? Jan's like, oh, that could never be a hit again. And Dean's like going, who's talking about hits? It's just an album track. Because that's what everyone thought, right? So now this becomes a huge hit. And Carl's saying, thanks, Dean, on the album. Liberty Records has told Jan and Dean, you ain't going on this bitch. Dean's mortified because he's busted right there. It's obviously him. But they never got in trouble. And even though it's a number 2 single, number 1 on Cashbox, a massive hit that was never really meant to be. But the Jan and Dean had no official participation in the album. Before we get into Little Girl I Once Knew, as I said earlier, there was a huge dump of Beach Boys party sessions that came out several years back, unplugged and unraveled, or I forget what it was called, I told you earlier. But they had 81 tracks from the party sessions. Fascinating stuff. And I want to run down some of the more key outtakes from the party sessions. Just a short comment. I didn't listen to every single one of them. I do have something of a life outside this show. But I did scan through the ones I thought were interesting, and I'm going to comment on some of them. There were several tries at Ruby Baby, which was, I think, a Dion and the Belmonts tune, if I recall correctly. Brian's singing it. And this outtake wound up on the 1993 box set. So this outtake is fairly well known. This is Dennis on harmonica. If you want to hear Dennis on harmonica, he does play on Ruby Baby. Brian's singing it, completely screws up the words, and it's hilarious. Forgot it. What are you going to do now? And then he starts singing the Flintstones, Abba Abba Yabba Dabba Dabba Doo. And then he starts going oink oink. It's really, really funny. You can see why I didn't go on the original album, but it's very, very funny. So if you want to hear Brian just making fun of himself and Dennis playing the harmonica, Ruby Baby. Satisfaction, the Beach Boys do the Stones. I talked a little bit about there doesn't seem to be much respect for Dylan, but there does seem to be some respect for the Stones. Brian was a big Stones fan, surprisingly. Brian and Carl leading this one. What's funny about this is whoever's playing the bass, pretty sure it's Bruce, doesn't get the concept of the third chord. So every time it goes to the bass note of the third chord, the bass just drops right out. And to be fair, it does do something kind of weird. I haven't played Satisfaction in a long time, but the bass does do something counter to the riff, something counterintuitive. But whoever's playing the bass didn't know what the bass did there, even though the song's 3 chords. He drops out every time they go to the third chord, just it's gone. So you can see why they didn't do that. Blowing in the Wind, they do Dylan again. Al singing again, really pretty nice vocal. Bass, atrocious, terrible. Carl does a very jazzy intro a la Graduation Day. So again, Dylan not getting much respect. I think the Beach Boys did respect the Stones. They just didn't think they just didn't do a very good job, and so they didn't use it. There's some interesting talk where the Beach Boys are talking about the Sunrays, which is the band that their dad, Murray Wilson, kind of adopted to be his new Beach Boys, and they were having a hit at that time. I think it was Andrea. Maybe it was I Live for the Sun. They had a hit about that time. Carl says he's happy for them, which is very gracious for Carl. They liked those guys, they liked the Sunrays, and so, although, well, I shouldn't say that. I think some of them liked the Sunrays. There's was some ugly incident when the Sunrays were opening for the Beach Boys, and the stage started getting moved on them, and they nearly got injured. So, probably some mixed feelings about the Sunrays. But anyway, Carl says he's happy for them. The band discusses the concept of the album. The band talks about pot, I should say. Carl urges Brian to delay the recording because he doesn't think they're taking long enough time with them. I'm sure Capitol wouldn't have been happy to hear that. There's kind of a nasty comment from Mike to Audrey, his mom. He says, Audrey, how long did it take Brian to learn how to walk? 4 years? I mean, it's kind of locker room humor, especially back in the day. That was acceptable between friends, but there's a lot to unpack in that little comment, and I'm not going to unpack it here, but it's interesting. And at the same session, you can hear Chuck, I guess it's Chuck, getting kind of impatient with them. Again, listen to California Girls, very undistinguished. Kind of goes back to what I said about my own version, party version of it, being equally undistinguished. You'll get to hear it if you're a patron. You can tell me how bad it is. It's fine with me. More Dylan disrespect. They do She Belongs to Me, and then Sonny Bono's sort of Dylan-esque Laugh at Me. And Laugh at Me goes off into a discussion of armpit odor. Mike, again, doing some not very nice humor at Sonny Bono's expense. I got something to say for Danny. I got something to say for Carl. This is a takeoff on Sonny Bono's kind of silly Bob Dylan imitation on Laugh at Me. And then he starts saying, Where's Dave? Again, the Where's Dave running gag throughout the outtakes of this. Mike, interestingly, makes a reference to Sonny Bono getting thrown out of a restaurant. And this must have been well known around LA because this was the incident. Because Sonny Bono, despite being a celebrity, got thrown out of a restaurant for either having long hair or wearing weird clothes or both. But that's what occasioned the song Laugh at Me that he did and that they're doing here or taking apart, however you want to look at it. So Mike knew about it and apropos starts talking about it. They do write in Cell Block number 9, the Robbins track that they would later redo as student demonstration time on Surf's Up. Mike clearly loves the song. You can hear it here. So, but the song completely falls apart in hilarity. Oddly, they do the Diary, the Neil Sedaka track. Bruce leads it, sort of, kind of appropriate. Bruce is the Neil Sedaka shipper in the band. They do a little bit of The Boy from New York City by the Ad-Libs, which they'd recently sort of ripped off with Girl from New York City on the Summer Days and Summer Nights album. It was the only song they tried on piano. Was this wise? I mean, they had just basically repurposed the riff for their own song. Did they want to kind of do it themselves and call greater attention to the similarity between the two songs? I don't think they should have done it. Then they do 2 Coasters tracks. One Kiss led to another in Smokey Joe's Cafe. Both, which Smokey's has a great Mike vocal. And it's interesting because remember I talked about this Beach Boys campfire show that they did in the late 80s, which was akin to the Beach Boys party sessions. They did both these songs at that campfire thing. So they revisited these 2 songs at the 1989, I think, campfire sessions. So, and it's really cool. Check it out on YouTube, these 1989 campfire sessions. And that gets us to the end of the Beach Boys party section, and now we're going to talk about The Little Girl I Once Knew. Okay, The Little Girl I Once Knew was released on November 22nd, 1965, 14 days after the release of Beach Boys Party. And it only made number 20, which was a shockingly low chart placement given how well all the band's singles had been doing. It actually was their lowest chart placement for an A-side since, I might be going back to 10 Little Indians. I have to check on that. But they've been placing regularly in the top 10 with their A-sides. And so this was, as I said, completely down to the fact that there was these two bar pauses in the song, which freaked out radio programmers. Bruce Johnston, in his interview with Mark Moore, said something really interesting. He said it was the first big boo-boo in Beach Boys land. And, Bruce is a really useful guy to have industry perspective on the band. I mean, he was a huge fan of what Brian was doing, and he was a big supporter of Pet Sounds, but he understood the industry side of it because he was basically had worked for record companies, for most of his career. And so I think Bruce understood right away that that was a commercial misstep. It was apparently suggested by one of the session musicians. I'm not really clear on who, but when we talk about this, this is a forgotten Beach Boys single. And what I did one special Pet Squares episode. Did the Beach Boys play on their own records? And I've thought about doing more of them. And one of the ideas I've had is, the 10 greatest forgotten Beach Boys songs. And spoiler alert, this would have to be number one. Because everyone agrees that 65 to 67 is the band's peak. Because you have everything. You have the classic, all the classic lineup. You have Brian at fully functional level. You have the incredible instrumental and arrangement complexity of the tracks. But you still have an element of the early innocence of the band's sound, and especially 65, you've got it all coming together. And so we're right at the beginning of the Pet Sounds era with this song, which was the purpose-built single for the Christmas market. I mean, this is what Brian put his energy into. This is the thing that he wanted to be known for. This was the follow-up to California Girls and Help Me Rhonda. This was at one time considered for the Pet Sounds album, or at least it seems to have been. So this single falls right in the middle of Brian's most creative and most highly respected period, and you would expect it, as such, to be one of his very best singles. And guess what? It is. In fact, if I was going to have to choose the greatest Beach Boys single of all time, I'm not sure I would pick this song, but I'm not sure that I wouldn't. It is phenomenally good. It is fantastic. And the only reason that it didn't make it is clearly because of that two-bar pause. Because if you listen to it, it is deliberately grafting elements of California Girls and Help Me Rhonda onto the arrangement. California Girls with the intro, and Help Me Rhonda with the bows, but it takes those elements and makes them better. To talk about this track, first of all, let's go through the musicians. This is the first single by the Beach Boys where none of the band played on it. We've got Billy Strange and Barney Kessel on the 12-string guitars, Carol Kay on electric bass, Howard Roberts, who wasn't often on their sessions, on 6-string electric bass, Lyle Ritz on upright bass, Al DeLore, grand piano, Don Randy on the Hammond organ, Hal Blaine, of course, on drums, Frank Capp, vibraphone, carrying over that vibraphone sound that was such a big part of California Girls and Summer Days and Summer Nights. Another reason I love this track. I love the vibraphone on Beach Boys stuff. Larry Hulley on tambourine, Roy Caton on trumpet, Steve and Plass on tenor sax, bass sax, Jay Migliore, and Jim Horn. It's the first time Brian cut the basic on a 4-track instead of a 3-track, but not a big change in his methodology other than that. Vocally, Dennis does not appear to be on it. I'm guessing, again, because he's probably still had some bronchitis issues. Although, once again, we're seeing a lot less of Dennis on the vocals now that Bruce is there. There's not always a lot for him to do, but Dennis was at the session.
Hold up, flag on the play. This is Adam, breaking in from the future, as they like to say. When I was working on the part of the show where I break down musically some of the stuff, something caught my ear, and I went and investigated further. And I want to say, first of all, I have the utmost respect for Craig Slewinski and the team of people that contribute to his research on who played what on their records, and 99% of the time I pretty much agree with what they have to say, but every once in a while I have a disagreement, and this is one of those times. The thinking is that Dennis was not on this recording, even though he was definitely present at the session, because there's not a place for him in the arrangement. And I was listening to the alternate version on I think it's the Made in California box set, which has an a cappella breakdown. Now, this is a take that was done a few days later than the released version, which is odd in and of itself, but I think I know why that happened. Anyway, when I sat down, I was pretty sure I heard 6 discrete parts, and so I went into Pro Tools and re-sang the middle triad. Now, there's Brian on top going, "She's not the little girl," except an octave higher from that. Then there's Bruce responding, "She's not the little girl I once knew." And then you've got Mike kind of doing ba, ba, ba coming up, right? And then there's a cluster of vocals in the middle. And I was pretty sure that was 3 parts. So if you subtract the other 3 guys, that leaves 3, Al, Carl, and Dennis. So what I did is to make sure I went back and re-sang them all, and I'll show you what I did in a second. A little disclaimer here. I have a guy across the hall who's really sensitive to noise, so I couldn't really go for some of the notes. It's a little pitchy, so cut me some slack on the performance. But here we go. And away we go. And again, a little bit sloppy performance for me, but this is what I hear on the breakdown of the record. She's not the little girl. She's not the little girl. And again, Brian, Bruce's, and Mike's parts are all around that. So the top part, I'm pretty sure, is Al. And again, this is a little pitchy. I apologize. I couldn't really go for the note because of the guy across the hall. She's not the little girl. She's not the little girl. And then middle, Carl. She's not the little girl. She's not the little girl. And then the part I think is Dennis, which again is, is kind of it's sort of the kind of part that Dennis often did. She's not the little girl. One note across, little. She's not the little girl. Okay, so to my ear, listening to the record, the top part is pretty clearly Al. The middle part is pretty clearly, a little less clearly, but I'm pretty sure it's Carl. And the bottom part sounds like Dennis. It's got Dennis's tonality. And Brian quite frequently would have Dennis take what's called the pedal tone, the simplest. You hold one note throughout, and then have Carl do the trickier harmony, whichever that was, and then Al would usually be on top. But if the tricky harmony was on top, Carl might do that. So this goes with their standard operating procedure if that Dennis would take the lower sort of straight part, because that's what Dennis's part is. So what's interesting is now there was multiple takes done on the vocals. There was some vocal overdubbing done when they dubbed to mono. So it is conceivable that one of the other guys did this part, Bruce, Mike, or Brian, and then overdubbed their counterpoint. But there's no reason to think that they would do this, and this is a pretty straightforward kind of 6-part arrangement that Brian might do. And we know Dennis was at the session. So even though Dennis isn't featured in sort of all the other parts of the song, I think Dennis is on this. And I think this also tells us why Brian cut the alternate version, which is kind of strange, because why would he redo the song when the second version is almost identical? A couple of the parts are held a little longer. Mike's parts, of course, are different because they were overdubbed in the mono mixdown. But the alternate version has an a cappella breakdown, which is what I went off of. And when I listened to make sure the arrangements were the same, I noticed that on the released version, the earlier version, the part that I think is Dennis is a little bit flat in spots. You can't really tell listening to the record. But if Brian had planned to do an a cappella breakdown in that part, then when he listened to the vocals without the instruments, he would have heard that Dennis was a little flat, assuming it was Dennis. And that would explain why he would go back and redo all the vocals exactly the same way, so that he could capture that section, so that it was good enough to be under the scrutiny of being an a cappella part, that is, without instruments. And then I think what happened is when he heard the a cappella version, even though it's perfect, he realized that it was just a few too many bells and whistles for the song, and went back to the original version. So my opinion is Dennis is on this track, and I think also this helps solve a minor mystery of why Brian cut 2 versions of this song.
Everybody else in the band is featured. We have the We Met When She Was Younger, which is Brian and Al, Brian on top. And then, very significantly for the solo second line, Carl. This is the first time Carl sings a solo lead line on a single. Very key development because, as we know, Carl would become, after Mike Love, their main lead vocalist. In fact, he would become their main lead vocalist, period, for quite a long time. We just got Carl's first major lead vocal, as in distinctive, where he sounds like Carl, on Girl Don't Tell Me on the previous record. Now, he's been promoted to lead vocalist on the next single. So very key development here. We got Carl for the first time on a lead vocal. Even though it's only a couple of lines, it's very clearly him, and it's the most featured vocal on the track. Mike Love has a little spoken word bit, Split Man, which is really cool. Bruce Johnston, once again, has a counterpoint vocal, just like he did in California Girls. Brian, she's not the little girl I once knew. She's not the little girl I once knew. That's Bruce, the second one. So, again, taking the California Girls sound. But the track, it's so good. It's just so good. Brian outdoes himself on the intro and on the breakdown. It's Brian's favorite intro he ever did. Well, sometimes he says it is. Fantastic changes. The organ arpeggios, the chiming guitar, the way they all mend together. Wow. In fact, let's take a special look at it right now.
So I'm just going to bash this out real quick. Nothing's too fancy, but you'll get the idea. And so what's interesting about that is the way Brian is turning around. Again, he's going off California Girls, because the California Girls bit goes like this. So he's basically in the same position, working off the same chord forms. Right? So now he's turning it around. A little out of tune, sorry. It's really ingenious because it's kind of keying off again the California Girls thing, but it's adding a new spin on it.
So you've got that intro, which repeats later, which just kind of sets up what comes next. Like the second time it happens when it comes in on the outro with all the choruses and the bass sax coming in, just giving it some drama. There's more of the lead bass from Carol Kaye that we know Brian used to use. The song just explodes. We can quibble with the lyrics. They're a little, I wouldn't quite say they're problematic. I mean, look, there's a lot of stuff we don't sing about anymore, but this is true to a certain teenage male dynamic. Maybe it's icky, but this is how a lot of teenage guys think, and that may be one of the reasons Carl carried the ball on the vocal, because he was the youngest of them. He's 17, I think, at this time, 16, 17 years old. 18? No, wait, how old was Carl? 18, I think, when this was recorded. 18, almost 19. But, lyrics aside, it's, it just, everything you like about the Beach Boys, it's got Pet Sounds, it's got everything about Pet Sounds is there, except the lyrical introspection. But you've still got the energy that you have in Summer Days and Summer Nights, because Pet Sounds, if you can make one criticism of that album, if you want an album that's going to pick you up and go, it's not that record. It's a somewhat low energy album in spots. Whereas Summer Days and Summer Nights is a rock album. It's got a big beat. So you've got the same thing you got with Summer Days and Summer Nights, where you've got a lot of energy and an explosion of sound with all those instruments. You've got everybody except Dennis in the band featured in some way. You've got electrifying changes. Just the way it takes you through. You got the intro. The verse doesn't waste your time. I love the stop, even though the in is a little sloppy in the first chorus. That's one flaw in this track for me. It's tighter in on the second chorus. I love it, even though it killed the song as a single. The chorus is simple, but it has another one of those exciting modulations that Brian liked to do, where you go into another key that just makes the hair stand on the back of your neck. And then you've got this bridge come out of nowhere, which is like a gospel thing. Da 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 da. La da day. I mean, I don't think they say lighter day, but it sounds like they say lighter day, which is kind of gospel. It's a lighter day, like a Bill Withers kind of idea. But it's exuberant, you know. And again, something that sounds usually isn't as exuberant. But this is just has so much youthful energy to it. You got a little gospel breakdown, and then we'll go back into the chorus, and you got the intro again, and then the chorus just takes you on out, and you just want it to go on and on and on. Greatest Beach Boys single of all time. It's got some competition for that, but I can't say it's not. This song is just phenomenal. And maybe some of you are casual Beach Boys fans and you've never heard this song. If you haven't, it's California Girls mixed with Help Me Rhonda, but better, in my opinion. It's just great. The song had another famous fan, John Lennon, who, again, obviously the band loved John Lennon. John Lennon loved this song. They had it. They had him on Jukebox Jury, which was an English show that reviewed records, and he just stopped. He said, "Turn that up. Turn that right up." And he made his love for the song known. George Harrison also had it on his jukebox. So the Beatles were hip to this track, and they really dug it. Some things to talk about with this. This song's particular place in Beach Boys history was reflected in the fact that when Brian did his very first solo show with the Wondermints back in, was 98, 99. I mean, I can still remember Darian calling me when they got asked to do this. And I think I was one of several people he called. And he actually asked me, should we take this gig? Because the Wondermints were doing okay. They had their own career. And he knew that this would take over their lives. And I told him, yeah, you should take this gig. Because you're gonna have the opportunity to do this music properly, and you're going to be able to rewrite the history of this man's artistic life, and you're going to be able to. You were born to do this. That's what I told him back then, and I'm sure a lot of other people told him the exact same thing. But the reason I bring this up is I can remember when this tour first happened with those guys, we were all holding our breath because of Brian's history. Like, was this really going to happen? And the first song that they came out with, when the first show, was The Little Girl I Once Knew. This was the song they opened with. This was their statement. Like, this is what we're going to bring you. And it was also probably because Brian only had to do Carl's part, so he only had to really sing 2 lines. So, it's a safe choice to open the show. But it was a definite statement, opening up Brian's whole period of solo touring with this song. Like this is how we're going to do it, and the level of precision and love that the Wondermints guys brought to this meant you could do songs like this and it was going to work. And the minute that song hit, and I remember bootlegs of that show circulated pretty soon afterwards because we all wanted to know, did this work or not? And I can remember hearing that and going, oh yeah, we're fine. When I heard Brian and the Mints guys doing this, and this was the song they started with, and doing it the way they did everything that they did prior to joining Brian, the stuff I'd seen them do, the stuff I'd done with them, yeah, we were fine. Brian was going to be fine. And this was the song that they used to make that point. Now, that being said, this is a forgotten Beach Boys hit. It didn't even wind up on a Beach Boys album to the Best of the Beach Boys Volume 3 in 68, I think, which was not a very popular album. It's interesting to think that there's a couple of other Beach Boys tribute-y songs that came out around this time that are very sonically similar. They have the same kind of vibe going on. There's This Could Be the Night by the Modern Folk Quartet, which was basically Harry Nilsson and Phil Spector, and She's Just My Style by Gary Lewis and the Playboys. And I was kind of interested in the chicken and the egg thing because they both sound very influenced by this song. They have, and I love both those tracks, and because they have the same sort of perfect storm of Beach Boys elements. And I was curious which came first, and they all came out. They all came out in November '65, around the same time, because this song came out in a little earlier than that. No, it came out in November '65. She's Just My Style and This Could Be Night also came out in November '65. So it seems like they all were happening at the same time, and they all just kind of came up. And it can't be that. I mean, it's possible that they were all these things were heard in their formative stages by the participants, because at least Nilsson was around. He certainly was in the vicinity. But it doesn't seem like Nilsson heard Little Girl I Once Knew and made This Could Be the Night. It doesn't seem like Brian heard This Could Be the Night and made Little Girl I Once Knew, because they all happened virtually at the same time, along with She's Just My Style. So it's really interesting that they all kind of wound up in the same place. This sort of culmination of what the Beach Boys were doing in '65. And if you like Little Girl I Once Knew and you want more another hit off that joint, This Could Be the Night and She's Just My Style by the Modern Folk Quartet and Gary Lewis and the Playboys, respectively, all came out in November '65. All became This Could Be the Night. I think may have been released as a single later than that, but it was the theme for a fairly significant movie that followed up to the Tammy show called The Big TNT Show. And so that was the theme for that movie. That came out in November '65. But from what I can tell, they all kind of came out independently of one another, out of the same cauldron of the Beach Boys' prior work at the exact same time. So it's sort of a trilogy in my head of just terrific lost Beach Boys songs, although She's Just My Style was a pretty big hit. And again, Just My Style, pretty big hit in '66. I mean, it came out in November '65, but remember what I was saying about this classic Beach Boys sound. We think about that starting to fade out of popular love when Pet Sounds comes around, which is in mid '66. I think it came out in May. But the Beach Boys sound, both by the Beach Boys and by its imitators, still very, very big in the early days of '66. So it's interesting to think about how quickly that turned around. And when we get into the Smile discussion, we're going to talk a lot about how the Beach Boys fell out of favor so rapidly. Part of the tragedy of the Smile discussion is the Beach Boys certainly were at the height of their respect when that was going down. They had a bridge that they had an opportunity to cross at that point, and it looks like that bridge was open to them for a very short period until the cultural zeitgeist just shifted, and they hadn't crossed the bridge in time. It was almost like a bridge, there's a burning fire on either side of that bridge, and Beach Boys had to get across it, and they didn't. But had this song been a hit other than Barbara Ann not, I think it would have helped. But on the other hand, Sloop John B is going to be the next single. Sloop John B threads the needle that Little Girl I Once Knew failed to thread, because Sloop John B has all of the Pet Sounds, John Philip Sousa kind of thing, but it still has a little bit of the Beach Boys fun in the sun, in that at least it's a nautical theme. But it's funny to think of that Sloop John B is a folk tune. And we had talked about how the Beach Boys almost were parodying folk music on the Beach Boys Party. And then they went and reimagined folk music in their own way, Pet Sounds. And so it's kind of funny to think that after, once Brian finally got around to thinking about folk music in a serious way, we get Sloop John B. And so you could argue that the folk music boom, though it very much informed Beach Boys Party, Brian wasn't ready to think about it in any serious way other than sort of at arm's length. And I'm sure Brian admired the Byrds records, and certainly Bruce did, because Terry Melcher was involved with the production of the Byrds stuff, and so was Gary Usher. So I don't remember who was first there. I think Terry Melcher was with one was there first, and then the other, and all you Byrds freaks are screaming at me because you know which was which. But it doesn't matter. Gary Usher and Terry Melcher were both very much involved in the Beach Boys world, and they were involved with the Byrds, and Byrds were cutting at Columbia at the same time the Beach Boys were. So they certainly were aware of what the Byrds were doing. So, I'm sure there was a lot of mutual respect there, but it's interesting to think that we don't really get the Beach Boys seriously taking on folk rock other than Girl Don't Tell Me until Soup John B. And we get this sort of wink, nudge, chuckle version of folk rock on Beach Boys Party. Beach Boys Party is what it is. And as I said before, like the Christmas album and like the In Concert album, you dig it or you don't. Or Beach Boys Concert, I should say. You either dig it or you don't. But it is what it is, and I'm glad we've got it. And that concludes my take on the Beach Boys Party. And coming up very soon, I'm kind of dreading this, to be honest with you, because this is a show where I've taken great pride in trying to bring you new information about the Beach Boys. Now we're going to be tackling not only the most overanalyzed album in the Beach Boys history, but one of the most overanalyzed albums in the history of rock and roll. The Beach Boys, pretty much an arguably greatest released work, at least most people think so, Pet Sounds. All I can say is I'm going to do my best to bring you something new and comprehensive about that album, and I'll get to it as soon as I can. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and remember, if you are interested and want to become or already are a patron of the channel or want to contribute, you can look at the first comment for how to do that, but look for a download link for the AMCB Party bootleg album, and you'll get a couple chuckles out of it. Alan's take of A Day in the Life of a Tree, that's good times. So look forward to hearing that, and I'll look forward to seeing you again. It's great to talk to you again. Okay, bye-bye.